All right, maybe we can go about and getting started here this evening. Kwe Psidowen, Deliwizi, and Pollard Ranco, Nakabanawepska, Nia, Nujao, Orno, Naka Wiki, Old Town. Hi, everybody. My name is Anne Pollard Ranco. I am a proud citizen of the Penobscot Nation. I grew up in Orono, Maine, and I currently live just about a half mile from the house I grew up in Old Town, Maine. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Darren Ranco, who is an associate professor of anthropology and chair of Native American programs and coordinator of Native American research at the University of Maine. He has a Master's of Studies of Environmental Law from Vermont Law School and a PhD in Social Anthropology from Harvard University. His research focuses on the ways in which Indigenous communities in the United States resist environmental colonialism by using Indigenous science and diplomacies to protect natural and cultural resources. He teaches classes on Indigenous intellectual property rights, research ethics, and environmental justice and tribal governance. He has served on a number of Native museum and academic boards, including the board of Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness, where he currently serves, and the Abbey Museum, where he was a trustee from 2005 to 2014, and is one of the two honorary trustees. As a citizen of the Penobscot Nation, he is particularly interested in how better research relationships can be made between universities, museums, Native and non-Native researchers, and Indigenous communities. The son of Nelson Newell Ranco and May Ranco, he grew up in Orono and currently resides in Dedham. One of the most common questions I get asked when I introduce myself to folks, being a Ranco myself, is, are you related to Darren Ranco? And it's always such a pleasure to say, yes, I am. He's my cousin. So I'm very, very happy to have my cousin joining us tonight and really look forward to this presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anne. Yes, it was good spending time with you at the walk. We had a real good Ranco contingent in Orono to Indian Island to honor the Wabanaki veterans, and it was good to see you and your family there. Um, yeah, so tonight I'm really looking forward to sharing. I think some of the people in the Blue Hill Heritage Trust community, I think, have heard pieces of this, perhaps. People, especially who've participated in First Light trainings and activities, I've presented there in different ways, but I wanted to. There's some really good updates that I'll share. But as always, in terms of fulfilling my professor role, I'm going to share some slides. So let me do that. I think I had have that the ability to do that. All right. Yeah, so one of the things I'll just add in terms of the bio that Anne so generously gave, and it's always, wild to hear someone your friends and related to introduce you in such a formal way. But I also serve as executive director of the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship, and I'll talk pretty extensively about that work because this is the commission, along with First Light and First Light Learning Journey and a bunch of organizations, are really motivating this work, performing this work in what is now called Maine around land back and rematriation across our homelands. So for me, the goals of tonight will be to introduce the commission, um, understand our work in the context of the legacy of stolen lands across our territory in what is now called Maine, um, explore key pieces of evidence related to Indigenous-led conservation. Some of this is just about like why, why should non-Native people support this work? And I think as a scholar, there's really good evidence that Indigenous-led and coordinated conservation work is some of the best out there. And then look to the future and how we can learn from one another across different communities, native, non-native, conservation, land trust, local communities, etc. The this idea that there is this movement out there around land back or hashtag land back or land return is uh, has gained a lot of momentum in the last less than decade, let's say 6 or 7 years. Not only here in what is now called Maine, but also nationally and internationally. Um, you see, just this is just one um, article headline from I think the Sierra Club magazine. Um, Land back movement unravels manifest destiny. Tribal nations are buying back their land one parcel at a time. And I think this is a really important kind of development in the larger movements for us as Indigenous people and Indigenous rights. Um, and then this quote, which I found online, and then realized that actually this was something I said. So it's really interesting to kind of come back to your own quotes. That just shows you how much of an ego I have. Um, but this quote, land return rematriation, which is the rebuilding of traditional Indigenous stewardship and caretaking practices to our ancestral places, and conservation work led by Indigenous peoples, intersects with several of the key issues impacting the well-being and cultures of our Indigenous nations, including, but not limited to, issues of environmental and climate justice, food sovereignty, health, and economic justice. And I think overlaying all of that is the profound work of healing our relations with one another and our places as Indigenous people. And so, using these terms, land back, rematriation, I just want to say a little bit about what those mean. Um, I think of these terms each as centering the right relationships between humans and non-humans. Land back or hashtag land back, which is again much more explicit political movement and is emphasizes a return of everything stolen from us or lost by us through forced assimilation and colonial violence um, that we've experienced as Indigenous people. So that includes land, language, ceremony, medicines, our kinship communities, etc. Um, Rematriation, on the other hand, while also centering right relations, really self-consciously centers women and tradition, not men and property. Um, it is very much about healing relationships between humans and non-humans and places, and really fulfilling our traditional roles as caretakers, as Indigenous caretakers of our places. It also very, in centering women, it's very much if you look at, on the ground, and I would include the kind of work that both Anne and her mom do in this space, like women who are, you know, on the front lines of planting the gardens, building relations with places that have been taken from us, really caring for land in very direct ways. This is a very much about women leading this work. And so Sherry Mitchell is one of the people who does this and is very great writer and expresser of what does it mean for Wabanaki women to be at the center of this work around land and rematriation. Um, and this is about recentering the role of Wabanaki women in our communities. For her, Wabanaki women are leading the work to recover our traditional ways of knowing and being through language, renewal of kinship networks, revitalization of land-based teachings that focus on the relationships that exist between all systems within creation. The women are also decolonizing our stories, developing pathways for food sovereignty, and protecting our lands and waters. And so I think it is very much work uh, of care for land and place that Wabanaki women are leading in very obvious and profound ways. Um, as a scholar, I think one of the ways into this work, and I think that helps, especially people not embedded within our communities or traditions, is to think about a couple of key frames of what motivates this within Wabanaki communities in particular. I highlight the one of these as Wabanaki diplomacy, which is a thousands of years old set of protocols and traditions around problem solving, which is multicultural and multinational across our nations. And then also, in addition to that, is the emphasis or recognition of our Indigenous knowledge and science traditions. Um, each of these plays really important roles in the work around land return and rematriation. But again, really in the context of the cultural work, provides this context within which we are operating as Wabanaki people. So when I say the emphasis on Indigenous knowledge on or science, that's really centering Indigenous people as knowledge holders with a responsibility to place. Um, in Indigenous knowledge and science traditions, you cannot separate the responsibility to care for something from the knowledge of that thing. That's a very common thing, at least for Wabanaki people, but so many Indigenous people. The act of knowing comes with a set of responsibilities for caretaking. Um, and then diplomacy, our diplomacy really centers participation by all, reciprocity, generosity, and the time it requires to build relations and make decisions. Our traditional forms of diplomacy, in terms of our confederacy in decision making there. Our most important meetings would actually begin with 7 days of silence, and then they would then be followed by 7 days of talking, wherein in Passamaquoddy language, the Dagwin Doluestu, the everyone would get a chance to speak. And that would really center the kind of radical democracy and consensus orientation, but like taking that time to think about what will be said and how it will be said in certain protocols and contexts is a really important part of our decision-making process in terms of our diplomacy that we mobilize in this work for land return and rematriation. So I mentioned that, I wanted to introduce the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship, which was seated, meaning all of the representatives were formally approved and appointed by the five tribal governments, chiefs, and councils in January of 2021. And so there are these two representatives from each of the tribal governments in what is now Maine that make up the commission. So it's very much a reflection of sovereign entities as our tribal governments coming together to stake a claim and fashion the work of land return and rematriation. Also important to our collective work is that when we act in confederacy and across our nations, in our minds and in sort of the protocols that we mobilize for our diplomacies, we always are thinking about Wabanakik, the larger territory of Wabanaki people, seen here on this map, and recognizing our relations in Canada, the 29 Mi'kmaq, one Passamaquoddy, six Maliseet, and two Abenaki bands in Canada that we are kin with and who our frameworks of confederacy are intimately tied to. So it's hard to disassociate the land from the knowledge from the decision-making frameworks that these are all go hand in hand. If people have participated in the First Light Learning Journey pieces of work, you'll see that one of the things that we try to look at is the ways in which conservation work has been implicated and tied to forms of colonialism and the property regimes created through the doctrine of discovery and colonialism as it appeared here and across our territory. One map that I think is really instructive, and I think this is these lands that you see in various shades of green are all protected lands, either through easements or as parklands or other kinds of protected statuses as conserved lands. Is that when I first saw this map, to center it in these sections of sort of the north, central, and eastern parts of Maine. what is now called Maine. It also overlaps significantly with these shaded areas, which were the disputed territories from illegal treaties signed after 1790, which formed the basis of our Settlement Act in 1980. So just to see these, like where these are located and where these are quote unquote protected lands, and where these lands that were taken from us illegally through illegal treaties that formed the basis of a settlement in 1980. It's hard to disassociate those the place of that and the places of stolen lands from us as Wabanaki people. So I think when you start to look at that bigger framework, you start to understand that there have been significant changes in the work of conservation and land trusts in and around the state of Maine over the last 7 or 8 years as well. One thing that there's kind of two threads to this, where we can understand the shifting understanding of land trusts and conservation groups in Maine and across the US and internationally. There are kind of two threads to this work. One of those has to do with the ways in which practitioners are working more significantly, especially internationally, less so nationally, with Indigenous peoples, and sort of how that forms the basis of so many of the frameworks of collaboration internationally in particular. And then the other thread of that beyond the practitioner is the role of scholars in really trying to look at the ways in which Indigenous-led conservation and land returns fit into the overall set of equations and measuring their effectiveness on in the terms of conservation, and really trying to understand what that looks like. So, as a scholar, I'm really interested in this making this claim and defending it. I think it's immensely defensible at this point in terms of saying like I think in one of the interviews I said the special sauce around conservation is having indigenous governance and science at the forefront of conservation makes it the most effective and the way that we can measure it. Um, some of the debates around that started in 2008 around a World Bank report called The Role of Indigenous Peoples in Biodiversity Conservation. And people know this claim quite well. In for those of us in the space of Indigenous conservation work, the claim in this report from 2008 was that Indigenous territories encompass up to 22% of the world's land surface, and they coincide with areas that hold 80% of the planet's biodiversity. This was very much a correlation that the authors of this work were making at the time, and it's still somewhat unclear where they got these numbers from. Um, so even the debate around sort of how accurate this is continues to today. There was actually a focus just last September in Nature around this statistic and how accurate it is. And whether this claim is actually helpful or hurtful to Indigenous people in the conservation space. So these authors, I think, pretty convincingly say that for a variety of reasons, and some of these critiques have been made over the years that this claim was not accurate. Um, uh, Both in the sort of territorial side of this, which is the 22%, as well as the claims around biodiversity concentrations. Um, you can see, uh, uh, ultimately what these authors come out with this saying is that we should not use the statistics to fill in for the actual scholarship around what we're finding in Indigenous-led conservation, nor should we um, dehumanize people so much where the statistics speaks for something magical that goes on in these spaces. And I totally agree with that. And I think they reference, and I'm going to reference even more, that since 2008, there's been a lot of scholarship that actually looks at it in more significant and ways and sort of understanding what is leading to very effective forms of conservation when Indigenous people are leaders both in governance and in knowledge systems and dictating how conservation works in and around the globe. And so you have a bunch of studies, and this is the only one that I'm a party to, talking about, when, where, and how biodiversity has been lost. Um, in this paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2021, we made a pretty significant finding that biodiversity actually losses have only significant humans have only been responsible for significant biodiversity losses in the last 400 or 500 years. And it's not from humans settling in places where there had been no human activity previously. In fact, we found that the biggest losses in terms of biodiversity have come in places that have been um, colonized by populations not originally in their places, and that has led to a real that conversion has really degraded not untouched ecosystems, but ones that were managed in far more balanced ways by Indigenous peoples. So I think what I like about this study is that humans, and I think this is on the practitioner side too, up until about 20 years ago, conservationists were trying to prevent all humans from engaging in using any lands that are being conserved or having access to them in any significant ways, presuming that all human societies were just aimed and destined to destroy biodiversity and conservation work. Our findings in PNAS have find a different story. There's so many papers in the last 5 years about this. Again, sort of prove it, despite the the perhaps erroneous claims from the World Bank report from 2008, we're actually seeing in the scholarship now how the most positive outcomes for human well-being and conservation is coming from in this Ecology and Society paper from 2021, where Indigenous peoples and local communities play essential roles, have over decision making, where their local institutions are regulating the forms of land tenure and are recognized as part of local governance. Um, in biological conservation from 2019, this shows in terms of um, effective conservation being tied to increased and recognition of Indigenous-led governance. Again, things like sovereignty, these sorts of issues, which are ever present here in what is now Maine. Um, again, also from 2019 for environmental science and policy, biodiversity and Indigenous managed lands in Australia, Brazil, and Canada has really led to the most protected areas, the most significantly protected areas, and showing that Indigenous communities, where we're able to enhance Indigenous land tenure practices, really ameliorate some of the national and global shortfalls in land protection for biodiversity by using a mix of conventional protected areas and Indigenous managed land. So using this kind of two-eyed science approach that is an Indigenous concept for how to bring different knowledge systems together. As much as I would like to give you a book report on all the studies, you get the picture, right? That this emergent scholarship starting in the late 2010s and coming into the last 5 or 6 years has really shown Indigenous-led conservation as producing these dramatic, both in terms of human terms, but also in terms of biodiversity and conservation goals, some the best kinds of outcomes. Into that context, we have on the practitioner level, um, people, especially here in Maine, where I think we've become quite a leader in this work, people coming together and the land trust community to form things here in Maine. It's the First Light Learning Journey, or First Light as an organization, where they really wanted to come together and build new partnerships with Indigenous peoples across what is now Maine, and begin a new era in how to do that work. Um, this movement started in 2017, 2018. It was responding to a bunch of different things, including the successes in the Penobscot River Restoration Project from earlier in the 21st century, where the Penobscot Nation was one of the key leaders in removing a couple of major dams on the Penobscot River, as well as things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that sought to address Indian child welfare issues in and across the state. Um, the First Light Learning Journey began to respond to those kinds of calls, as well as calls um, for further recognition and firmer recognition of our sovereignty as tribal nations here in what is now Maine. I want to just point out in the original kind of concept around First Light, the goal was to restore Wabanaki true prosperity, expand Wabanaki stewardship, rebuild Wabanaki stewardship and presence across the landscape. It wasn't tied to goals being set by the conservation community per se. It was to really think about our prosperity and engagement as Wabanaki people. Um, the First Light, and you can read a lot more about First Light and the First Light Learning Journey and the joint website that the Commission has with First Light at dawnlandreturn.org. But you can see it centers the Wabanaki Commission as the director of this work, which is, of course, representing the tribal nations. Um, but it's also, uh, you know, what is the role of non-native people in this work? It really directs through various forms of collaboration, um, non-native land-oriented organizations to kind of come together, which I think is a really important part. This strength of our movement in what is now Maine comes from the fact that the land trusts and the Wabanaki Tribal Nations have both formed coalitions of work, which has been larger than each a single organization or even a single tribal nation can do on its own. And I think so that synergizing of interests and practices has been really important to our successes. You can see that there have been a host of organizations that have formed the leadership of First Light. Um, this is the delegation leadership of these represented by these organizations in Maine, but um, of the 85 land trust conservation entities in what is now Maine, I believe 65 of them have actually participated in some form of a First Light training or engagement. But it is these organizations that you see on the screen now that have formed the real leadership around this work and sort of bringing it to force and helping find funding and all sorts of other things to kind of advance this work. First Light, as an organization, again with the Wabanaki Commission and other tribal partners at the nations, have come up with a vision around what land return looks like, as well as what does the work of First Light mean in terms of going forward around land trust and conservation work. It has as these three R terms, the kind of actions of what land trusts can and should be doing in and across what is now Maine. So relearning, recentering, and returning, sort of that beginning the journey, continuing your practice, and enacting change, that these are the frameworks that First Light mobilizes. And I think through that have come up with the framework for land return that uh, is land return without cost, without restrictions, so not with easements, and with a fund to help care for it. That is the gold standard. Sometimes, pieces of this are not entirely possible, but so far the vast majority of land returns and the work that we continue to do reflects this First Light vision around land return. Again, just so you can understand what the First Light and how the Wabanaki Commission work together, um, it is a framework of interdependence, but also centering Wabanaki Commission and tribal nation sort of ideas and frameworks. But there have been times when the First Light organizations, First Light as an entity has been, perhaps we can go away, or perhaps we can be subsumed under the commission and just have a single tribal entity leading this work. And the commissioners have repeatedly said, no, you're not, you're not going away. We're in this work together for the long haul. And I think that notion that we will walk this path together, similar to things like the two-row wampum or any number of the kind of frameworks of diplomacy that we as Indigenous people mobilize of like working deeply together, but also being interdependent and work having that work centered has been really important part of our the way we work together. So coming back to the commission, this is the mission statement, which in some ways speaks for itself. It's really about improving the health and well-being of our people, Wabanaki people, to expand our access, management, ownership of lands, to practice our land-based cultures, acquiring land, sharing, co-managing, um, working with land trusts and conservation organizations on these acquisitions, both on the real estate market, but in lands currently held by land trusts, and sort of figuring out how to meet this, the number one goal, which is about our access management ownership for supporting our land-based cultures in our communities. So we really do seek to create this partnership through education, a stronger conservation movement that reflects Wabanaki expertise and perspective. Um, we've had a number of land return projects. This is just like a brief overview of these. I think some of these have been focusing on lands that help current tribal land managers connect lands and improve our ability to manage currently held lands by adding to them and connecting parcels, which make for things like conservation and management and creating corridors for animals, this sort of thing. That's been a major part of the land returns so far. Also recognizing places that have been stolen and creating frameworks for land justice. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the Pine Island example. And then, especially with the two northern tribes, the Micmac Nation and the Holton Band of Maliseets, who have far less land holdings than the two southern tribes, Penobscot and Passamaquoddy, really looking at creating frameworks for supporting tree farm, some economics, but securing access to sites and ability to manage lands that these tribes have not been able to manage, including things like river frontage, access to fishing resources. These sorts of things have been a real focal point for the tribes up north. So the first significant one that addresses this issue of land justice has to do with um, the return of Pine Island to the Passamaquoddy tribe, and this is at the beginning of the commission being seated. There's a really great video that Sunlight Media Collective did. It's about 20 minutes. You get to see Dwayne Tome up in a plane, and um, that's fun, I think, in its own way. And then you really understand what it means for the Passamaquoddy community, for the Passamaquoddy tribe to bring back an island that was promised to them in treaties and taken from them by the state of Maine by just renaming it, just naming it something else, and then saying, "Hey, it's not a part of the treaty," and then they were able to claim it and sell it and to other interests. And so, the media coverage has been really positive around that in terms of, here you see Native American tribe in Maine buys back island taken 160 years ago. And so this is really started off such a significant place too, because it's a place of ceremony and culture for Passamaquoddy people. And it's been really such a healing kind of opportunity to bring this place back into Passamaquoddy holding and caretaking. We have, as part of our ongoing projects, which we refer to as the tributary cohort of projects, we currently have 11 land return projects Four of them are pretty much completed. So seven still outstanding. And they represent over 52,000 acres of land in and across Maine. Um, and the overall cost of these lands is roughly $51 million in terms of the fundraising needed to complete the return projects. Um, Obviously, it nearly doubles, or more than doubles, land holdings of the two Wabanaki nations, Micmac Nation and the Holden Band of Maliseets in northern Maine, and then also provides significant connective and land management opportunities and access points for Penobscot Nation and Passamaquoddy tribe. These you can see what these projects are and what their status of to a certain extent through the Dawnland Return website, and so I encourage you to go look at where they are and what the status of them is. Um, One of the most significant, the by far the most significant project in this tributary cohort um, is connected to lands, although it's not exactly overlapping with them, but is connected to, again, a taking by the state of Maine um, of lands that were guaranteed to this time my tribe, the Penobscot Nation, in many treaties. These four townships in and along the where the east and west branch of the Penobscot River, referred to as the Upper Four Townships, in terms of this being kind of the cradle or the center of our cultural activities up the Penobscot River and providing access points to the Katahdin region and all sorts of other and critical resources for us, as well as family hunting territories. That basically, in the 1830s, the state of Maine came up with a scheme to, basically sell these lands against our will through various forms of trickery, promising certain things about voting and allowing the tribe to have control over how whether or not these would be sold, and then the state just doing it anyway. Um, and that is very much in very close by and a part of the same ecosystem and cultural landscape that this Wasatech East Branch project, which involves 31,000 acres of land. Um, it would represent a very large and one of the largest collaborative land return efforts in the U.S. Um, and this is just such an important piece of work related to Penobscot Nation homelands and our ability to connect in ways to the Katahdin region through corridors and our own land management and access um, from Indian Island all the way up through to the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument and into Baxter in a way that we haven't had access or controlled in hundreds of years. And so you see, um, existing preservation areas, existing tribal land holdings in this map, and really enhancing our ability to access and manage all of these lands up through Katahdin. Uh, the commission is not just about land return. I mentioned rematriation as, something more than just land return. Um, there are two projects that are make what we do with land return work that much more important. I think one thing I keep saying to folks is that we're not interested in land returns just because we love owning property. Oftentimes, owning property comes with a lot of resources and commitments and responsibility that our tribal governments are often, strapped and under-resourced to do. But at its core, we're choosing the places that are most important to us and that speak most diligently and importantly to the practice of our land-based cultures. So one of these has to do with work we call We Commit, which is really about cultural access. Um, Tony Sutton, who also helps out with the work at the commission. This is basically us creating a framework with our land trust partners. So Wabanaki people will know where they are welcome to gather on protected lands held by land trusts. We're very much still in the process of working out how to do this with the Maine Coast Heritage Trust on some of seven of their properties here in 2025. Um, and once we figure out sort of how it'll work, some of it involves us really communicating to tribal citizens where these lands are, what can be accessed, in what ways, and to really make the work reflect tribal interests in the way we do it. So I think really, and you could read more about this again on our website, but this idea of cultural access and access agreements with land trust partners, we commit is just one part of that. The other piece of this work that has been really important in the last several months is the establishment, which first started in January of 2024 as a call by First Light. Well, actually, sorry, in October of 2022, a call from First Light to establish a solidarity deposit for the Wabanaki Commission. At the time, it was called the Self-Determination Fund. Since has been changed into the Passamaquoddy framing of Wangidame Giziap Jaweg, which means let's take good care of what is returned. And that fund initially raised 1.5 million through First Light organizations and partnerships and matching grants and all sorts of things. Eventually, over close to $2.5 million um, has been able to really fund land-based projects in our communities, which are about not just the land return lands, doing projects and getting people out and reconnected to places where we have been disconnected from forcefully in most situations, and really supporting tribal governments, tribal NGOs, tribal citizens in trust-based philanthropy, 1 to 2 year awards. Um, and that these funds are really about repairing, rebuilding, and sustaining our relationship, kinship, and access to place by directly supporting the people in this work. The framework for this fund and sort of what the focal areas were established by the commission after we conducted a series of over 30 intensive interviews across the tribal nation communities, asking people what are the focal points of rematriation land return. And so these six bulleted points that are in recommendation three, but really involve how to involve youth involvement around land and culture, build long-term responses for cultural healing and connections to land, connect places to each other, places to people, our access, help Wabanaki people who want to make their livelihoods through relationship with land, guiding, canoeing, harvesting, etc., incorporating tribal language education, land stewardship activities, and recognizing the importance of our spiritual relations with one another, places connected to our ancestors and their activities in our non-human relations. Again, you can see through our website the grantees. We made 14 grants, which came to an amount of $625,000 worth of trust-based philanthropy, which had from at least after the money was after our First Flight partners helped us raise the money, the commission designed this process. All of the people involved in making the decisions were Wabanaki people. As the review team, we got 10 really great reviewers for this work, and then they decided on the 14 entities, citizens, NGOs, and governments that got these funds. And this offer, this is real money. This is real work that is connecting. I would say like anything from, and you can read about them, but anything from creating caches and of reserves of foodstuffs and um, plants, medicines, to connecting youth to travel to places that have been returned or in the process of being returned, and telling stories and teachings upon the landscape, to connecting with and protecting portages and all the rest that you should read about the many great projects happening. So one question always is, well, what can we do? How do we support this work? The big funding question is definitely around the uh, Wasatek project, but you can support the Wongidame Fund. You can support our ongoing work across the Commission and First Light. Um, and there's all sorts of ways. If you go into our website, if you're, part of a land trust not near tribes, there's all sorts of ways to participate and support our larger work as well. Sometimes it's not just about resources, it's about, emphasizing and working across partners and building constituencies as well. So for me, yeah, I just want to reflect on, the importance of this work, I guess, as a tribal citizen and researcher and faculty member. This is the most important work that could be doing. It's healing work, it's hard work. It's also very difficult. It allows me to think about 7 generations and sort of what we might be leaving behind for them. But it also, the challenges are that there's this ongoing colonial legacies and structures and the property system and how land trusts even work, how easements work. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of really centering Indigenous caretaking roles and responsibilities. Um, which creates a human touch across conservation spaces that sometimes is not appreciated or well understood by mainstream conservation practice. And then lastly, of course, that the land return and rematriation are interconnected and need each other. Um, you know, I used to put up a slide of someone tweeting, the land wants us back too, right? Not only do are we aching for it as Indigenous people, but the land is also aching for us. And so I think that reason for land back is really about our caretaking, is really about our rematriation, cannot be overstated. So I'll end there. It's about 6:49, so hopefully there's some time for questions and all sorts of things. And I don't know. Yeah, how's it going? Thanks, Ann.
Thank, thank you so much, Dr. Ranco and Cuz. That was such an excellent presentation, and I always am so appreciative to hear of the ongoing work, and it always leaves so hopeful after I listen to you because of your deliverance and just knowing all of the amazing work that's going on behind the scenes that you're a part of. So, Kuchibaliwini for sharing with us all tonight. And I think we do have a couple minutes, maybe a handful of minutes for
Yeah,
some Q&As.
sure.
It looks like there are a couple in the chat, so thank
Yeah.
you very much for those who left their questions. The first is from Soren, and it touches a little bit upon the conservation easements. Their question is,
Oh.
could you speak a little about how the Commission views land encumbered with conservation easements? Does the Commission view these as perpetual in the same way that land trusts do?
Um, that's a great question. God, you really want to get me into a controversial space, about this. I think, um, I think, there's been a lot of really good and vibrant discussion over the last several years around easements. As you saw, the standard that we have with our land returns is to not have land returns with easements. Um, and not because easements are the worst thing in the world. There are far worse things, I think. Um, Building a bunch of Walmarts or whatever on places, or I think the issue really is that easements have historically kept Indigenous people out of our places, right? That it has separated humans from nature, and it's hard to even talk about easements writ large, right? That different easements have to, I mean, and I know you and your work, you've been looking at different properties and different things where yeah, like with We Commit, and I know you've talked to Tony Sutton and others about this. There are lots of places, especially now that we actually have working relationships with land trusts, that people are like, yeah, actually, you picking or harvesting in, your traditional ways would not necessarily violate the easement and the property owner or whatever their sort of thing is. But for far too long, and again, this is just sort of the practice of how easements have been regulatory and kind of like a cop and not understanding cross-culturally what it is that we might want to do on lands. And then, you know, even as we began this work, it was kind of like, oh, if there's an easement, we'll actually have to go out and monitor what you're doing at first to make sure you're not harming it's that's not an ideal situation given a legacy of colonialism and policing us as Indigenous people. And it harkens back to the 19th century when the state of Maine closed the commons through hunting and fishing regulations, and so many people, including people we're related to, and like who were beaten and were killed by exercising rights to treaty rights for hunting, fishing, etc. So, I think it's that legacy and that history where, I kind of want to, as we move together in relation, I think that's the kind of the answer to like solving the issue of easements. I would like to think of, there are all sorts of sort of possibilities of like creating easements. I want to think about them as easements 2.0, where uh, built into easements is Indigenous access, and like more firmly, and different states have different regulatory frameworks for that, and so there might be some policy fixes, but I think you still have to address that ongoing legacy of the ways in which easements in the past have been really, you know, kept us out of our places. And I think that sort of um, framework of how conservation shuts people out, right? I mean, I think that relationship with humans is really important to that. Um,
Absolutely.
so I think,
One thing
yeah,
that really struck me, oh, sorry.
no,
One
go
thing that
ahead.
really
Yeah.
struck me from the We Commit text that you shared with us all was the quote, "If you're a Wabanaki, you are home."
Yeah,
And that
that's right.
line really resonated in how it reframes land not as something to be owned or managed, but as a place of belonging. And how can rematriation, this is my own question because I'm really curious to hear your answer. How can rematriation work help conservational shift frameworks of ownership and relation plus invitation?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think that you see that, I mean, on the one hand, like we have to build new models of collaboration and new models of care, right? That all of us can recognize as legitimate. That takes a lot of work, right? That takes, and I think the brilliance of We Commit, and this is really the brilliance of Tony Sutton, I think. He wouldn't be like, it was my idea. But the shift there was, as opposed to us as Wabanaki people begging a conservation entity, someone with an easement to let us in, he's like, well, why don't we do the work of those who are committed, we commit to Wabanaki relations, saying, hey, we'll put the thing up. We say you're home. We say you're invited here. Like that shift in who does what and who builds relation and who's responsible for it sounds kind of like minor, but it is not. If you think about then the histories of just the fact that an easement is a way of keeping us out of it, out of our place. So I think, yeah, it's a complicated. It's hard to just talk about it as easements because I know that the question is about. I mean, easements are attached to deeds and they are perpetual, right? I mean, like that is true of the question. Um, but I think, we're exploring ways in which, we're really inspired by the Native Land Conservancy down in Massachusetts. They've been able to attach cultural use agreements attached to deeds, which kind of also supplement in a perpetual way, like Indigenous access in perpetuity as well, right? So there are ways to think about different tools that would, but we can't. But what I'm saying, whether it's We Commit or a cultural use agreement that's attached to a deed or any of these other tools, the work needs to be done to make it sort of easements 2.0 because of that.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question. It's sort of interesting because so Christina is asking, are there metrics of positive impacts resulting from land returns to build the case for this work among those who may require data to support the effort? And I think you might have something to say about
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So
I mean, I tried to share.
yeah,
I think what's interesting, that's why as a scholar, I approach this, and I take that very seriously, like the idea that people might need to be convinced that this is, conservationally good. I think the scholarship is building in overwhelming ways. I mean, the issue is uh, if you dig a little bit deep into the surface of any of these things, of like metrics and positive impacts. Um, People measure things in different ways, right? So, biodiversity is one way. And that's where we kind of got pulled into that debate by the World Bank in some ways in 2008. And so being the biodiversity poster child, I'm not saying that it's not true. And I think those correlations are actually quite profound and important. Um, and we've dug down into them like that why is that the case in terms of well biodiversity benefits from as opposed to just putting numbers on a page, yeah, indigenous forms of governance and te land tenure systems being supported in conservation work. So like you have to actually trace what the metrics are and sort of figure out like, why are these things happening and what are the like what are those positive results and why is it that these positive results are happening? And I think that scholarship that I referenced just four or five, examples of, which is, dozens more than that, are showing that. I just think that um, conservation work, um, the idea that conservation is motivated by science as opposed to a legacy of a particular set of tools. I mean, I'd love to have that debate with someone, like in terms of like, has the rise of conservation um, prevented the destruction of biodiversity? Has it prevented global climate change? So my question would be, has the status quo been very effective? Like, are we really like really double or tripling down on like those tools because they haven't
yeah.
done the things that they said they would do? So I mean, I think I'm just I think making the argument and making arguments that are informed by study and science, I will 100 always. I'm convinced that if supporting indigenous land tenure systems, is supporting indigenous governance, and supporting indigenous science in conservation work, having indigenous people and indigenous knowledge holders, um, um, really direct this work. I'm quite convinced that that is producing some of the best outcomes nationally and internationally. So yeah,
Absolutely. I think that's a great note to end on. Chiwali
well,
Rita
well,
Hazy, thank you so much. I'm really happy to hear you and share this space with you this evening. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for your just being willing to listen and to learn this evening with us all.
absolutely. Thanks,
So,
Anne. Good to see you.
yeah, take care. Upditch.
Update. Bye.
See ya.